Okay, so this week we're looking at the destruction of the two kingdoms. So last week we spent a long time thinking through the prophetic warnings. And the prophetic warnings, because these two destructions happened over 100 years apart, they sometimes get disjointed in our mind because we think of them thematically along the same tracks, but chronologically, they're several decades apart. So today I'm going to bring you through more chronologically the events surrounding the destructions of the two kingdoms. So we are beginning with the conquest of the northern kingdom of Israel by the kingdom of Assyria, the Assyrian Empire. And this happens in 722 BC. So last class, after the north was conquered, we talked about how Assyria would go in and deport many of the residents of the northern kingdom of Israel and spread them out throughout the Assyrian Empire. And they would bring thousands of outsiders, so from other provinces of the Assyrian Empire, back in to repopulate Samaria. And this was kind of a great political move on Assyria's part because it completely broke down the national allegiances of the people that they are conquering. They threw everybody in a pot, jumbled them up, and tried to really spread them out so that the only land that they are loyal to, the only politics that they are loyal to, is the emperor of Assyria. Now, note that the explanation given by the historians in 2 Kings 17, the reason given for this conquest is the religious failure of the north. So their idolatry, their turning away from the proper worship of Yahweh. It's interesting to put this up against the prophets that we read last week, like Amos, who, they do mention idolatry some, but their kind of driving critique and their driving threat kind of against the people that they are prophesying to are justice issues. They say, you have mistreated the poor, therefore God is going to seek retribution. And so that's not to say that that's a firm disagreement. We talked about how the care for the poor was all wrapped up with the law and the worship of Yahweh. So they do go hand in hand. But you do see these two traditions, this prophetic tradition and then these historian traditions looking back, and they highlight or emphasize one reason over the others. That's just, again, to point out the different ways that these groups are looking at the event, either of their time in the terms of the prophets or of several decades before in the terms of these historians, and reinterpreting them through their theological bias. Okay, notice that even though last time we saw the development of the conception of God, the understanding of Yahweh, from Yahweh as a storm god to Yahweh as a more cosmic deity, and perhaps the only true God, right? We talked through that. As of the destruction of Samaria, there is still a close association between Yahweh's immediate domain and the land of Canaan, the land of Israel. Because we have this great story where the Assyrians have to bring back Yahwistic priests back into that land to teach the people how to worship Yahweh so that Yahweh doesn't continue to smite the land, right? Yahweh is seen as the God of the land, first and foremost. And so they're worshiping other gods, obviously. They're kind of the outsiders. They're worshiping their original gods, but they also are worshiping Yahweh so that they can stay on the land. So even here we see that the people haven't quite made full sense of who God is yet, right? So even the historians are having this close association of God with God is first and foremost the God of that land. And so we would say today, God is not more God of Israel than anywhere else, right? God is the God of the universe, the cosmos, right? God's not even more the God of earth than another planet. But still in their minds, that land was personally owned. Yahweh had the title to that land, and in order to stay on that land, somebody had to be worshiping him, or else he would get angry. So again, a really interesting stage in the development of where people think God is focusing and of people's understanding of who God is. So the north is destroyed. So what of Judah? So the conquest of the north happens in 722. About 10 years before the fall of Israel, Ahaz, the king of Judah, made himself a vassal to Assyria. So what this means is instead of joining with Israel and the other surrounding kingdoms that took an overt hostile position in resisting the spread of the Assyrian Empire, Judah said, I'm just going to pay you off. I am going to accept the fact that we are going to have a suzerain vassal relationship. You are under my, Judah is under Assyria's sphere of influence, kind of the same way that King Herod was a vassal king to the emperor of Rome in the Christian era. The king of Judah says, fine, you're the emperor, whatever, I'm going to pay you money, but I keep my throne and I keep my country. Yet, whenever this kind of relationship is contracted, it's not just a one-time payment, right? Once you enter into that kind of vassal state relationship, those tributes have to keep flowing. Judah has to keep paying Assyria year after year. Obviously, this seems like a good idea in the short term. Long term, this is, oppressive taxation taken to the maximum, right? It's not even taxation to help your own people. It's getting literally sent to a hostile foreign ruler. So what happens is that Ahaz's son, Hezekiah, takes the throne and decides to stop paying the tribute. And so in 701 BC, so about 2 decades after the north falls, Assyria attacks Judah in order to try to punish them and get them back into this vassal state relationship. This attack is the source of the words at the beginning of Isaiah 1. So Isaiah 1:7, your country lies desolate, your cities are burned with fire. In your very presence, aliens devour your land. It is desolate, as overthrown by foreigners. Right, so this is about the time that Isaiah starts to write down his visions. This is the context of his writing. As we read through Isaiah, we saw that he's actually starting with events and visions and oracles that he wrote and received well before this. But the version that we have in the book of Isaiah is a version that he is writing down, immediately in response to Assyria's attack on Judah. Now, Jerusalem does not get captured. When Assyria attacks Judah, the countryside is burned, some cities are destroyed, there's a lot of destruction. Judah is brought to its knees, but Jerusalem stands. What ends up happening, though, is that Hezekiah retains his kingship, but basically has to grovel and say, I'm sorry, we'll start paying the tribute again. Please don't kill us. And there's some intervention by God here too, but kind of long story short, this punch to Judah by Assyria has the effect that it always meant to. Judah falls back in line as a client kingdom. Hezekiah's son, Manasseh, was incredibly loyal to Assyria. So he saw everything that happened when his father rebelled. He was incredibly loyal. Now, in God's eyes, Manasseh did incredible evil. The Deuteronomistic historians and the prophet Jeremiah ultimately placed the final blame on him for God finally allowing other kingdoms to overtake Judah, right? They both say that his sins were so great that even the righteousness of his son was unable to make up for it. So the entire country, several generations later, ends up being punished for Manasseh's sins, pushing God over the line. But socio-historically, because he is so loyal to Assyria, there is political stability during his reign, and it is a long reign. Now, obviously, idolatry is rampant, the social issues are not corrected, the rich are still taking advantage of the poor. But in terms of the existence of the kingdom of Judah, they are not under threat. Now, we get to probably the king in the history of both kingdoms that is portrayed in the single most positive light, and that's Josiah. Now, if you remember several weeks ago, modern historians believe that it is during the reign of Josiah that a lot of these books, beginning at 1 Samuel and ending in 2 Kings, their first draft is being written. And we know that because during Josiah's reign is when this scroll is rediscovered in the temple that seems to have been an early form of Deuteronomy, right? And so this school of scribes and educated persons that are reflecting the theology of Deuteronomy that we see in these histories, right? That's why they're called the Deuteronomistic historians. They flourish in the time immediately after this scroll is rediscovered. So it makes a lot of sense why these historians who are writing primarily during his reign have him in such a positive view, and he, right, becomes a big cheerleader for their religious perspective. Now, so Josiah is taking the throne in 640 BC. So 640 BC, Josiah takes the throne, and by now, Assyria is still the hegemonic power, but their chokehold over the ancient Near East, or at least over Israel, is not as severe, right? The political stability that Manasseh left and problems elsewhere in the empire meant that the eyes of Assyria were not immediately on Judah, which gave Josiah a lot of room to institute domestic reforms, especially domestic religious reforms. There's no more outside pressure to allow pagan worship, or at least a significantly less amount of outside pressure to allow pagan worship. So, like I said, during this time is when scribes rediscover this scroll of Deuteronomy. Modern scholars hypothesize that this was probably brought to the temple by refugees from the northern kingdom of Israel during the destruction. It was probably filed away and forgotten during the reign of Manasseh, but then rediscovered as they're cleaning out this temple because of kind of how devout Josiah is. And in reading this, Josiah kicks off massive religious reforms. So we hear that for the first time since the reign of the judges, Passover was celebrated. So think about that. Passover took such a huge and prominent place in the Exodus. But from the words that we hear for these historians, no one had celebrated it for hundreds of years. And so Josiah reestablishes Passover as a major holiday. He destroys idols and their altars, and he really does consolidate the religious power back to the temple, right? We heard that it had been dispersed. A lot of these high places of altars, both for Yahweh and for other gods, had popped up. He destroys those, reconsolidates power in the temple, and really pushes these reforms based on the theology in Deuteronomy. So that specific way of viewing things is Josiah's marching orders. Now, ultimately, these reforms were unsuccessful. Josiah dies, and they do not continue after his death, right? Remember, the popular will of the people was religious tolerance, including tolerance of idolatry. All the people were living fairly stable lives under Manasseh, even if Assyria was taxing them, things were stable, things were good. Josiah is doing all of these changes. They're not here for it. So after his death, they don't continue. Josiah dies in a battle with Egypt at the valley called Megiddo. Now, if that sounds slightly familiar, it's because in Hebrew, the area is called Har Megiddo, which is where the English word Armageddon comes from. So we know that word as this cataclysmic final battle that is supposed to take place at that one valley in Judah, right? So Armageddon is not like a cosmic concept. It's pointing to one specific valley in Judah and saying the final battle is happening here. And so it was a really common area. It's a good strategic place to hold, and it's a wide open valley under a mountain. So it was a place that battles happened pretty regularly. And so this was a known commodity for the authors kind of throughout the Bible. And so they placed the final battle there too. But this is where Josiah dies. So what happens after Josiah? Well, in 605, Assyria is fallen to Babylon, who takes over their empire. And Judah also is their vassal. So after Babylon becomes the hegemonic power, they really just slip into the place, right? They fill the vacuum that Assyria has left. So Judah's relationship as a vassal to Assyria just gets transferred over to Babylon. Theologically, we hear that Judah falls because of their unfaithfulness and their uncaring attitude towards the poor. Really the same things that contribute to the fall of the north. Practically, what ends up happening in 2 Kings 24 is that Josiah's son, Jehoiakim, ascends to the throne in 608 BC, and in 601, he stops paying tribute. So again, this is this constant socio-political issue where a vassal state stops paying tribute to their emperor. Bad things follow. So he stops paying tribute and then conveniently dies in 598 BC. The next year, in 597, Babylon decides to force Judah to pay up. So in 597, Babylon attacks Jerusalem for the first time. They capture their elites, including the king, takes them to Babylon. But Jerusalem survives, it's not destroyed yet, and the kingdom of Judah still exists. So, Zedekiah is the last king of Judah who ascends the throne after the king is captured by Babylon, and he's put on the throne as a client king. He lasts 10 years, and then he decides, I'm going to stop paying tribute. Really bad decisions. And so from 587 to 586, Babylon now sieges Jerusalem. So they're not just going in They're cutting them off from all food. They're cutting them off from all supplies. They're waiting for them to be completely and utterly demoralized. And then they burn the temple down. They kill the king's children in front of his eyes. And then they gouge out the king's eyes so that the last thing he sees in his life is the death of his children. They don't kill him. They put him in chains and walk him back to Babylon blind. All of the most prominent residents of Jerusalem are brought into exile. All the priests and scribes and government. This is the final end of the line of David, right? Or at least the line of David that is on the throne, the dynasty. So what begins as the great kings of God, we see the decline into idolatry and into unfaithfulness to caring for the poor. Then they sell themselves to become a vassal state, and then they can't even keep that covenant. So again, we have this consistent theme of kings breaking covenants. Breaking a covenant to God, breaking a covenant to the people, breaking a covenant to a foreign king. And as a result of this continued breaking of covenants, they find the destruction of the kingdom. So now we have all of these priests and prophets and scribes and a whole bunch of Judean people in exile. So what happens? Well, here we enter a new era of Israelite religion. This is probably the formation for the first time of what could properly be called Judaism, right? Because we are seeing now it's just the tribe of Judah, right? Remember, when the first temple was still standing, all of the tribes of Israel would have been worshiping Yahweh. So it was Israelite religion. But now the other tribes have been lost. Judah is in exile. And so much of the Judaism, say in Christ's day, the Second Temple Judaism, is influenced by exilic theology. What we consider the Old Testament canon probably takes its final form, right? The Torah gets edited, these historical books get edited, even the prophetic books take their final form, and with the exclusion of those last books like Ezra and Nehemiah that talk about the return of the people, most of the canon's final form, most, not all, there's always exceptions, is incredibly shaped by the exile. So, while Israelite religion is dominated by the Exodus story, Judaism, and the Judaism that would arise in the Second Temple era when they return from this exile, is dominated by exilic theology. So the theology of exile and return. We also see a change in their understanding of God. And this is why I would say that probably Judaism and their monotheism, kind of in the modern sense, really arises during this exilic period. In Ezekiel 1, we see God envisioned on this mobile chariot. So now finally, he is understood to be with the people outside of the land of Israel. Right? We knew before that God's influence extended beyond the bounds, right? He had prophets crown the kings of the surrounding areas, but those were border states. Now they're taken far away, and God is seen to be over the whole world. So remember, I started class by saying when the north was destroyed, there was still this close association with God as God of that land. Now we finally see God no longer being tied to that land. So in the exile, they have this religious revelation that God goes with them. God has power and authority over all lands. Good. And then we have this kind of understanding of who they are. So, who are the children of Israel? Now, mostly just Judah, but they still use the term, their historic name of Israel. And so in Isaiah, and mostly this is written by who scholars call second Isaiah, which is not the prophet Isaiah that is preaching before the fall, but is probably another prophet during the exile. Because if you look at kind of the length of life, it would be almost impossible for Isaiah to be preaching the year that King Uzziah died and throughout the exile. So a similar prophet in the same prophetic tradition whose writings are recorded in the same scroll, right, the scroll of the prophet Isaiah. We call him second Isaiah. His writings are from chapter 40 to chapter 55 in that book. So these are all of the prophetic statements to the children of Judah in exile. What we see is this rededication to the role of the chosen people as a specific servanthood of God in the world. So it's in this section of the book that we get what we call the servant songs. These eventually get applied to Christ as an individual because he is the fulfillment of Israel's calling. So we hear this echo of the role that Israel has to be a light to the Gentiles. We hear that kind of back from Abraham that it is Israel's job to spread God's blessings to all people. So remember, the role that Israel was supposed to play that they lost because of the establishment of the kingdoms and the breaking of the covenants, during exile becomes a crucible that purifies their self-understanding again. So they recapture their role as divinely appointed to a mission. Lastly, in Jeremiah 31 and 32, we get the talk of a new covenant. So, in their mind, they had the covenant with Abraham, they had that fleshed out with Moses. That covenant was broken, right? They broke the covenant, they were pushed into exile. What's their hope? Their hope, according to Jeremiah, is that God will establish a new covenant with them. And when they talk about a new covenant, they're being much more kind of tangible than we usually talk about. In Jeremiah, when it talks about a new covenant, they are talking about returning to the land of Israel and living there as God's people once again under a kind of covenant. In Christianity, we take this language and we apply it most extreme, right, to the most extreme sense in Christ. Right, Christ is not just a new earthly covenant, but the final new covenant. In its original context, though, Jeremiah is talking about how he is envisioning a restored Judah with the people having passed through the exile, taken a punishment, but now back into right relationship with God. So as we're reading Jeremiah, when he's talking about a new covenant, he's talking about returning to the land after the exile is over. So what are our takeaways? The biggest takeaway, I think, from the story of the fall of the two kingdoms is that nobody has a right to anything apart from what it is God's pleasure to give you. It didn't matter how hard the residents of Israel and Judah worked to farm the land, fought to defend their land, or relied back on the idea that their ancestors lived on the land. the Bible is clear that no child of Abraham has a right to the land of Canaan. It belongs to God. And so it is God's pleasure to allow people to live there if they are abiding by God's covenant. It is also within God's prerogative to remove people if they are not abiding by God's covenant. And so it puts us, kind of refreshes us when we think about God's promises to us. God is going to be faithful. That's without question. And we can reject God's promises. And if we do so, then we have rejected the promise. We have said no thank you. And sometimes when we say no thank you, God will respect our decision. So, the children of Israel were given the land, and because of their actions, they said, no thank you. Okay. Second takeaway. Even in punishment, the big goal of electing Abraham and his family is still in play. So remember, God's ultimate goal with choosing Abraham is that all the persons of the world will find blessing. God is training up this group of people in order to restore a relationship with humanity. God punishes them. God still doesn't forsake them. God goes with them into exile and uses that as an opportunity to deepen their relationship, to correct their relationship. Third, it is here, in this time period, that our understanding of God's nature probably develops the most until Christ comes as the full revelation. So it's here that we finally understand God is the only true God, without question. God is a cosmic creator, not just the God of the land of Israel. And God is truly everywhere, even in Egypt, even in Babylon. Not just in the Ark of the Covenant, not just in the temple, not just in Canaan. Okay, that's all I have for you. God bless.